Hello, bodybuilding fans around the world. It's the Tominator here, and today I've got a special treat for you. We're going to be ranking the best, the greatest bodybuilders to ever step foot on stage. And not only that, but we're going to break it down in detail across a series of distinct measurements. That's right, we've got 4 different categories here with sub-scores for each, for a total of, get this, 16 discrete criteria. These will all be scored on a scale of 1 to 10 for every competitor, and the totals then added up to determine the final winner, the ultimate GOAT of bodybuilding. Okay, so I already did something like this a couple of years ago, ranking the top 10 bodybuilders of all time, so you can go check that one out if you haven't already. But there, I was mainly basing it off of Olympia and Arnold Classic victories. This video will still incorporate Olympia titles, but I've put less emphasis on the Arnold Classic, since it disproportionately benefits modern bodybuilders. Instead, there's a bunch of other factors thrown in here, ranging from posing proficiency to legacy to evaluating the physique itself, hence the lengthy runtime. I've never seen anyone break it down this granularly before. Usually, when it comes to these conversations, people just kind of go with their gut feeling or choose based on personal preferences with 1 or 2 overriding attributes in mind. But doing it this way and really quantifying everything should help to minimize individual bias and make for a more thorough and objective analysis. Now, that being said, this is never going to be 100% objective, okay? So don't go in thinking that way, or you'll be sure to walk away disappointed. Granted, certain aspects like number of Olympia victories, for example, remain totally black and white. But for the most part, there's an unavoidable element of subjectivity when it comes to judging bodybuilding. So the aim here is not so much for perfect impartiality, but rather comprehensiveness. And of course, I hope you'll find it entertaining as well. I know I had a heck of a time putting this thing together. Truth be told, I haven't felt this inspired making a video in ages. Okay, so before we dive in, let's check out our list of nominees. Remember, we're talking about the GOAT here, people. That stands for the greatest of all time, which means there can ultimately only be one. And given that the highest possible achievement in professional bodybuilding is becoming Mr. Olympia, it would be disingenuous to include anyone who never actually managed to claim this elusive title, regardless of how popular they might be or how marvelous we personally think their physiques are. So that rules out some real heavy-hitting Hall of Famers like Flex Wheeler, Kevin Levrone, Sean Ray, and Kai Green. Sorry to all the fans out there, but it's true. Oh yeah, I might as well give fair warning now that this video is gonna be pretty ruthless. We've got so much to cover, I don't have time to soften every blow with caveats and compliments. So if you're the overly sensitive type who can't stomach a little criticism or controversy, best to turn away now. So in the end, I narrowed it down to 9 names, which is still a lot. In chronological order, we've got Sergio Oliva Sr., Arnold Schwarzenegger, Frank Zane, Lee Haney, Dorian Yates, Ronnie Coleman, Jay Cutler, Dexter Jackson, and Phil Heath. In my opinion, these are the only names we should be concerned with when it comes to the GOAT discussion. And even then, I'd argue that really only 5 or 6 of them are truly in contention. But for the sake of completeness and balance between the old school and the modern era, I threw in some dark horses like Zane, Oliva, and Dexter. Plus, I think this sort of variety makes for a more fun and compelling comparison. But enough babbling, let's get to what you all came here to see and start scoring these guys. So first up, we've got to talk about the physique itself. This is perhaps the most important aspect to consider when evaluating a bodybuilder's greatness. After all, the entire point of the sport is to craft the most impressive muscular body humanly possible. The problem is that it's also very subjective, and there's a number of different factors that come into play. First and foremost, you've got muscularity. And notice I say muscularity and not mass, since mass implies total body weight, whereas muscularity is more of a relative term. Pound for pound, how much muscle are you packing on your frame? Now, given that there's so many names to consider, I'm not going to go through each and every one, or we'll be here all day. Rather, I'm going to cover the highs and lows and maybe go over a couple in the middle. So at the high end of the spectrum, we've got Ronnie with a muscularity score of 10 out of 10. Dorian and Jay were right on his heels with 9.5s. It's a fact that no Mr. Olympia has ever been bigger than Ronnie at his peak, where he tipped the scales at nearly 300 pounds on more than one occasion. He had a big frame, but he filled it out to the max. You'll notice that the old school guys score much lower here, even if they were huge for their time. That's because I'm not really adjusting for era. So Zayn only gets a 5.5 because he was a damn featherweight compared to the rest of these guys. And if that seems unfair, judging 70s bodybuilders by modern day standards, you're right, it is. But who said life was ever fair? Go cry me a river, you whining crybabies. Believe me, they'll have their chance to make up for it soon enough. Okay, next is conditioning. This is Dorian's domain. He scores a 10 here because he was always peeled to the bone and hard as granite. Phil, Dexter, and Ronnie weren't far behind, but Jay scores a little lower due to his inconsistency from year to year. Sometimes he was diced, like in '01 or '09, but other times he came in soft, like '07 or '08. At the bottom, we've got Sergio Oliva with 6.5. Conditioning was never his forte, and he often looks smooth and unfinished, even compared to someone like Arnold, who himself never had top tier condition, it has to be said. Next up, we've got structure, specifically skeletal structure, alright? So this has little to do with flow or lines, it's more about having a wide shoulder girdle, narrow pelvis, the right limb versus torso length, small joints, and overall height. Sergio and Haney are prime examples. They each had small hip and waistline measurements, stood within the ideal height range of 5'9" to 5'11", and had a superb shoulder to waist ratio. Zayn and Coleman were great here too. Arnold was solid with all his height and that barrel-like ribcage, but he loses a point for being relatively thick-waisted and having overly long limbs with a too short abdomen. Phil and Dexter bring up the rear because both of them were narrow, and Dexter scores a half point lower still for being roughly 2 inches shorter. On the plus side, they did have enviably tiny joints and good proportions between the arms, legs, and torso. Speaking of which, let's move on to symmetry and proportions. Okay, so this one needs some unpacking. Firstly, when I say symmetry, I mean strictly bilateral symmetry. Does the right side of the body mirror the left? That's it. As for proportions, we already just partially covered that with structure, so we're really only concerned with relative muscle belly size and balance here. Does the lower body match the upper body? Are the biceps too big for the triceps? Do the pecs overpower the shoulders, etc.? I feel that guys like Oliva, Zayn, Haney, and Heath tend to excel here. Despite having very different looks, one thing they all shared was very balanced and symmetrical development. Yates falters in this regard, mainly because of that torn left bicep, which threw his symmetry completely out the window. It was especially bad in his case because it happened so early on in his reign. In contrast, Ronnie and Sergio both suffered tricep tears and various injuries, but not until the tail end of their careers. And if we're going to nitpick, and of course we are because that's what I do, Dorian's arms were always too small for his body anyway, even before the injury, given those enormous lats. Arnold also scores fairly low on this because he was rather top heavy, and his biceps and pecs outshined his triceps and shoulders. Dexter gets marked down for arm asymmetry and not having any calves, while Jay loses points for his subpar forearms and lower back. Oh boy, I can already feel the emotionally outraged fanboys preparing to rip me a new one in the comments section. Okay, but next up we've got aesthetics. I know this one's highly subjective and isn't technically judged, but hey, there's a good argument that it should be. After all, any fans who claim Arnold or Zayn had a better physique than, say, Ronnie or Phil, this is undoubtedly what they mean. I think it deserves to be factored in, especially in light of the fact that we weren't grading on a curve for muscularity or conditioning, where these old school guys are at a major disadvantage. So it should come as no surprise that all the golden era icons score highest here, with Frank attaining a perfect 10. I mean, come on, aesthetics was Zayn's calling card. His name goes practically hand in hand with the term. Dorian and Jay score lowest because, just going by the eye test, they had the widest waist and the blockiest looking physiques. Ronnie and Phil don't get dinged quite as bad because, despite a couple off years where they each rocked unsightly bubble guts, they were both reasonably aesthetic in their primes, and their pleasingly round muscle bellies helped too. Lastly, the final physique subcategory is something I'm calling peak performance. This was actually added in last minute to help some of the more standout names because, frankly, no pun intended, Frank Zane was scoring too high. But it's not merely arbitrary, I do believe it's important. When you think of mind blowing physiques, who comes to mind? Arnold 1974, Dorian 1993, Ronnie 2003, Phil 2011, maybe Jay in '09. Oliva and Arnold get some bonus points for their era as well. I know it's not consistent with how I rated most of the other categories so far, but it's not fair to compare Oliva with Ronnie. He'd get like a 3 if this wasn't adjusted for. So we have to put this in perspective. Relatively speaking, Zane and Dexter were probably the least impressive, so they score the lowest. Alright, so that does it for this first section. Tallying up the scores, we have Ronnie in first, Haney second, Phil and Sergio tied for third, Jay in fifth, Arnold and Dorian tied for sixth, Zane eighth, and Dexter ninth. Now, let me just state at this point, and it can't be stressed enough, that this isn't how I believe these guys would actually place if you plunk them all on stage together at their peaks. Obviously, the modern guys would blow them out of the water, because as we established in one of my recent vids, mass and conditioning are paramount, and aesthetics barely count for shit. But that's precisely why I came up with this more holistic set of criteria to help even the playing field, so to speak, and hopefully make for a more comprehensive assessment. I'm not claiming this method is perfect because it's definitely not, and you're free to disagree, but let's move on. This next section relates to posing and presentation. Because, after all, what's the point in building the greatest body ever if you can't even show it off properly? That's like designing the world's most amazing exotic sports car and forgetting to put in the engine. Anyway, the first subscore here is for the mandatories. This includes the 8 compulsory poses, or 7 for anyone prior to Ronnie, plus the 4 semi relaxed positions. Yates scores the highest here because he was shockingly effective in this arena. His only weak poses were the front relaxed and front double biceps post tear. His side chest wasn't the best, but it was solid enough. And while his most muscular sucked, it wasn't officially judged back then, so he catches a break there. Ronnie and Phil weren't far off because their only bad shots were the ab and thigh and side tricep, and the ab and thigh and front lat spread, respectively. Perhaps unexpectedly, Arnold winds up towards the bottom here. Why? Because while he looked tremendous in the front double biceps, and was pretty good in the side chest and back double as well, he was fairly average in the lat spreads and had a poor ab and thigh. Think about it, most of his best shots weren't even compulsory poses. And you can barely find him in the side triceps at all. I think there's literally like 2 or 3 photos floating around out there amidst a sea of literally hundreds. And he even outright refused to hit certain poses altogether when they called for it, like during his infamous comeback at the 1980 Olympia in Sydney, Australia. So Arnold gets penalized for being a bit of a cheater. But when it comes to the individual routines, he makes up for it big time. The only ones who score higher are Zane and Haney, mainly because they were less repetitious. But all 3 were graceful, artistic posers who knew how to show off their strengths and hide their weaknesses. Sergio Oliva comes in dead last because his posing was stiff and shaky. Video footage of him is rare, but I managed to track some down, and gotta say, it was a disappointing spectacle. He makes an effort, I'll give him that, and his physique really carried him, but to be perfectly blunt, the posing itself just wasn't smooth at all. And he often relaxed between poses and sort of just skipped the transitions. Coleman fares little better. Look, in the 90s he was fine. His routines were nicely choreographed at least. But by the 2000s, he was acting a fool, raising the roof, not controlling his midsection, and throwing in all sorts of goofy dance moves. It often seemed like he was just winging it up there. One could argue, as Chris Aceto once suggested while speaking with Dave Palumbo, that Ronnie basically ruined the art of posing, since this sort of lazy approach became all too common after his reign. I made an entire video on it a while back. so I have to dock him heavily for that. When we add up the values, we can see that Sergio really shoots himself in the foot here. He's by far the lowest, and I suspect this will come back to haunt him. To be fair, whatever deficiencies he had in this area are somewhat understandable, as bodybuilding was still in its infancy, so the art of posing wasn't yet refined. And like I said, Sergio's physique was so awe inspiring, he didn't necessarily need to be adept at posing in order to get the job done. But still, looking back, his presentation skills were downright amateurish compared to most of the guys who would come after. Alright, but continuing on, we come to the most objective part of the video, titles and track record. Most importantly, Olympia titles. How many do you got? I simply assign the number right there, so it's a 3 for Sergio, 7 for Arnold, 8 for Haney, and so on. Pretty straightforward, and refreshingly for a change, not up for debate. So I don't want to hear about robberies or politics or this and that. It's in the history books, guys. You can go look it up. I also decided to include Olympia runner-ups. While not as distinguished, obviously, this is still worth accounting for because it shows how many close calls these guys had. This is particularly beneficial for Jay, who holds the all-time record with 6 second-place finishes. 4 painful times to Ronnie, once to Dexter, and once to Phil. Interestingly, Phil is actually the next closest with 2, first in 2010 and then again in 2018. It should be mentioned that Dexter had the most top 3s, but I'm sorry, top 3 is not the same. You're not exactly challenging the champ when you're in 3rd, so that's why it wasn't included. Arnold Classic titles were also omitted. Even though it's the second biggest show in bodybuilding, the event didn't even exist until 1989, so that would unfairly punish the old school guys like Lee and Frank Zane, and ironically, Arnold himself. Total pro wins is our next metric. This one was tricky trying to make it work on a 10-point scale. Dexter holds the record with 29, so he had to get a 10. Ronnie was next in line with 26, which is about 90% of 29, so he received a 9. Dorian had 15 pro victories, or roughly 50% of Dexter's total, for a score of 5. You see how it works. It gets a little dicey though when we go back to the old school days, since a lot of their contests were held outside of the IFBB, and I'm honestly not sure in some cases which ones qualify as pro shows. So I kind of took my best guess using whatever limited knowledge of these other organizations I happen to have in order to decide what qualified and what didn't. Obviously, if the contest had amateur or something like that right there in the name, it was excluded, but many were not so explicit. Keep in mind, I'm also relying primarily on Wikipedia for these stats, since, believe it or not, I don't actually know their entire contest histories off the top of my head, guys. So there's a margin of error here you'll just have to live with. Ditto for this next subscore, career winning percentage. Here I didn't even bother discriminating between pro and non-pro shows, as most of these guys only entered 2 to 3 amateur events tops before qualifying for pro status anyway. I just counted up all the first places and then divided by the total number of shows they did. So for example, Arnold and Dorian's scores of 8.5 denote that they each won roughly 85% of the contests they entered. Incredibly, each man only lost on 3 occasions. In fact, with Yates, I believe it was only twice at the professional level. You can notice that Dexter actually has the lowest score, which isn't all that surprising considering he's competed 3 to 4 times the amount of the rest of these guys. Dexter's participated in over 90 shows at this point, whereas Arnold and Dorian didn't even reach 25. 20 to 30 is the norm here, by the way. So while Dexter might have won more than anyone, he's also lost a ton along the way. On that note, we've got to acknowledge longevity and just give it up for the Blade. The man's been competing for over 2 decades now and hasn't skipped a beat. For any basketball fans out there, he's basically the equivalent of Vince Carter, the only pro in history to compete in 4 consecutive decades. Think about it, Dexter turned pro in 1999, competed all the way through the 2000s and 2010s, and just placed second at the 2020 Arnold Classic. That's unparalleled longevity. He rightfully scores a 10 on this metric, and it's the main reason he was even included in the first place, given the gap between him and the others in terms of number of Sandow trophies. Anyway, to determine these scores, I basically just counted up all the years they actively competed, then did some weird math to make it proportionate to Dexter's score, since he's the benchmark. I believe I had to divide by 2, then times by 0.77 or something random like that, because Dexter's been competing for so damn long, even dividing it in half wasn't enough. This includes their formative years as well before they turned pro, because, as stated previously, it was sometimes difficult to delineate between amateur versus pro competitions for the older guys, but it is worth mentioning that any gaps were skipped. For instance, Arnold didn't compete between 1976 and 1979, so he doesn't get credit for those years, even though his career technically spanned from 1965 to 1980. So, all that makes sense? Probably not, but you'll just have to take my word for it, I guess. Okay, so when we add up the numbers, Ronnie emerges on top for this section. And he would have totally run away with it too, except for the fact he had such a slow start. The guy barely won anything for the first half of his career, which really messed up his overall winning percentage. Yates, Haney, and Arnold, while they boasted the highest winning percentages, simply didn't compete enough to pull it off. The edge here definitely goes to the modern guys, since there's so many more contests around today than there were back then. Finally, we come to the last category, which, for lack of a better label, I'm referring to as relative greatness. This encompasses things like level of competition, era dominance, and impact and influence. Level of competition is pretty self explanatory. How tough was the competition during a bodybuilder's given time period? Oliva and Schwarzenegger by far had the easiest go of it, as they only had to fend off like 2 to 4 competitors most years, and both of them essentially even had a freebie. In Oliva's case, nobody dared challenge him in 1968, and he won unopposed. Arnold won by default in 1971 since everyone else was disqualified. So, I mean, come on, that sort of thing makes a mockery out of these so called competitions and would never happen today. On the flip side, Dorian Yates went up against probably the deepest and most talented lineups in history during the 90s, repeatedly defeating the likes of Wheeler, Lavroni, Ray, El Somebody, etc. is no joke. So he gets a well deserved 10 for that. Ronnie didn't have it much easier, especially in his first couple years going up against most of the same. But by the early to mid 2000s, the talent levels were starting to drop off, so that's why he scores a point lower. You can see the gradual decline as we go along to Jay, then Dexter, then Phil, who, by the way, still face tougher competition than all the old school guys in my opinion. Kai Green, Dennis Wolf, Sean Roden, Dexter Jackson. That's not exactly a walk in the park either. Next is what I'm calling era dominance. It's almost the inverse of level of competition in a sense, because if you're way ahead of the curve, suddenly the opposition doesn't seem so tough. Sergio clearly scores the highest here, as he was light years ahead of anyone else back then, at least until Arnold arrived. Schwarzenegger similarly receives a high score on this since he single handedly dominated the first half of the 70s. Now, as for Ronnie, you might think he'd be right up there too because he utterly destroyed the lineup in certain years, most notably 2003. But the thing is, he also had some off showings as well, leading to controversial decisions, like in 2001 or '02. So that's why I bumped him down a notch. Dorian falls in the same boat. Dexter was easily the weakest of the bunch since he only won once against an off version of Jay Cutler. In retrospect, you could even say it was something of a fluke. And last but certainly not least, we've got to acknowledge impact and influence, where Arnold is far and away the king. In fact, he utterly transcended bodybuilding itself, so I had to break the rules and award him an 11 here. Not only did he undoubtedly inspire more people to start lifting weights than anyone else in history, but he also introduced the Arnold Classic and all its various spin offs. So, like him or not, he elevated the entire sport, and the bodybuilding world owes him a great debt. Next in line would have to be Yates, Ronnie, and Zane. Yates and Ronnie mainly because of their unmatched training intensity and motivational workouts, and Zane because he was arguably the biggest inspiration behind the creation of the increasingly popular classic physique division. Jay and Lee also score well because they were and continue to be very classy ambassadors for the sport. Phil and Dexter, on the other hand, kinda get the short end of the stick here, as their careers are still potentially ongoing, and so we haven't had time to fully digest and appreciate their lasting legacies. Also, let's be honest, the petty social media beefs they often get involved in don't exactly help their image. Okay, so summing up the scores, we can see that Arnold takes the cake here. Ronnie and Dorian are next, with Dexter a distant last. And now we come to the moment of truth. When we add it all up, who comes out on top? Drum roll, please. Ladies and gentlemen, I give to you the indisputable greatest of all time, Ronnie Coleman. With a total score of 120, he wins by a convincing margin. In second place, we've got Arnold. Lee Haney is third. Looks like Dorian Yates and Phil Heath are tied for fourth, and Jay Cutler rounds out the top six. After that, there's a bit of a drop off with Frank Zane in seventh, Sergio Oliva eighth, and Dexter Jackson ninth. Alright, so in hindsight, do I agree with this order? More or less, yeah. If we're being honest, though, I feel that Olympia wins supersede everything else, so I'd probably move Phil outright ahead of Dorian. But other than that, I'd say the dominoes fell into place here pretty nicely. Keep in mind, the differences were surprisingly minuscule. We're talking a point here or half a point there, so the order could easily be rearranged. The only thing I'd say for sure is that Ronnie earned his GOAT status. But the real question is, what do you guys think? Do you agree with these rankings? I mean, there's so many factors in play and so much gray area here, there's bound to be disagreements. But hey, that's all part of the fun. So let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to check my pinned comment where I'll explain some of the cut categories and the thought process behind why they were ultimately discarded. But thank you for watching, and don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed. And make sure to click that subscribe button for more bodybuilding commentary and analysis. Until the next time, though, this has been the Tominator signing off, and I'll be back.